Volunteer organisation Comhlámh has called for an end to volunteering in orphanages overseas. Now, according to Comhlámh, there are 8 million children currently in orphanages. And although the volunteers who travel abroad to work in orphanages have the best of intentions, they're perpetuating a system that is harmful to children. Joining me in studio is Gerry O Donoghue, who's the founder of Maintain Hope. Gerry, you're very welcome to studio.
Mary.
Your organisation, you used to send volunteers to orphanages in Kenya, and now you're calling on people to stop volunteering in orphanages overseas. I think this will come as a big surprise to some people.
Yeah, it certainly came as a surprise to me because along with most people who volunteer in the global south, you feel that you have something to contribute, that destitute children will surely benefit from the expertise of volunteers from the global north. But 80 years of research and my own experience on the ground, and probably most importantly, listening to the voices of the survivors of those institutions, very quickly made me turn my thinking around. And in fact, even for those orphanages that are on the face of it extraordinarily well run, institutions damage children, and there is no such thing as a good orphanage. And volunteering in an orphanage is actually perpetuating a system for which gives very bad outcomes to the children.
Okay, there are so many questions arising out of this, but let's start with the situation in Kenya, the country that you're familiar with. Why are children in orphanages there?
Well, I think it's important to remember that probably the percentage in Kenya is even higher, that of those 8 million children globally, 80% of those have at least one living parent capable of looking after that child. And that percentage is even higher in Kenya. And what happens is that the difference between family disintegration and a family hanging together can be a very simple matter of school fees, it can be a leaky roof, it can be an unpaid doctor's bill, or it can be an overdue rent. So that it doesn't take much for people to be persuaded to give their children to these institutions.
So economics,
poverty,
are at the root.
Absolutely. Poverty is the common denominator in all of this.
In all of the cases.
Poverty.
Can you say that, though, with certainty? Because children are abandoned for many and varied reasons.
Absolutely, yeah. And I don't think anybody is going to make a case that there is no place for some institutions for children. There are some children for whom a place of safety is the only option. For example, in cases of serious abuse or neglect, or where every other option has failed. And people will argue, and it's difficult to disagree, that surely they are better off in an orphanage than on the street. But what that does
and are they not?
They're actually not. Because what actually people to say that is to ignore the continuum of care that's available between being on the street and being in an orphanage. The optimum one being, of course, kinship care or care in the community. And none of those options are explored as a first resort, whereas even Kenyan law itself will state that being sent to an institution is a matter of a last resort. But for most of those children, it is their first port of call.
You and others were before an Oireachtas committee today, so what was your message to them?
Our message was really to raise awareness, because many thousands of Irish people travel to Kenya and to other places in the global south on a tourist visa. They engage with children in an unqualified way. They are of tremendous goodwill. They fall in love with the children. They read stories to the children. You know, the children fall in love with them, obviously. And what they're doing on the face of it is an extraordinarily good thing to do. But if you can imagine a child who sees a batch of volunteers for 2 weeks, you know, they exchange all kinds of promises and emotions. Yeah. Then that group goes away, another week, two more come.
Group arrives.
So the children suffer from serial abandonment, and that in itself leads to serious attachment disorders. So you can imagine somebody who at 17 years of age is told, okay, now you go out into the world, you find your own place, because we have done everything we can for you. No exit strategy, no expectation of what society what expects of them, no planning. So,
but Gerry, if you're right, and I accept the evidence you're talking about, but if you're right, what is going to happen to these children in countries like Kenya if the volunteers stop coming, if the funding stops coming, if the orphanages are closed down? Where will these children be?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really important point, because what we are trying to promote is responsible transitioning away from the present model to a more sustainable model with better outcomes. So nobody's advocating that we close down orphanages overnight, which would be disastrous, because bad deinstitutionalisation is worse than no deinstitutionalisation at all.
Yeah.
So what we want to do is, for the moment, keep them in place, but gradually build capacity so that the people who feel there is no other resort.
But sorry, who's going to build the capacity? Who's going to take responsibility? Because you and others have been filling the gaps that the Kenyan government, the Kenyan state, has fallen down on.
Yeah. Well, I think there is no task in Kenya, whether it's to do with childcare or anything else, that a Kenyan isn't capable of doing. So it's a matter of drawing together the community, building capacity within that community as to how to run their affairs, even small things like governance, reporting responsibility. And believe me, Kenyans are more than capable of doing that if they're given the incentive, if they're given the encouragement, and they're given the backup. And that is what I would see responsible volunteering doing. Basically, building capacity so that you are getting rid of your own job, if you like.
And you no longer send volunteers to Kenya.
No.
What do you do there now?
What we do is we have formed partnerships with communities in Kenya who basically have identified through the local authorities children at risk of institutionalisation, children who are well able to be deinstitutionalised. Their needs are identified by a social worker. They are registered with the local county authorities. They are seen as being destitute or in need, and we, through fundraising, will fill the gaps until that family is back on their feet again. We don't resource all of their needs, but we are partners rather than patrons, really.
And would you also be utterly against adoption to other countries?
Well, I think a child's natural environment is probably the best. I certainly wouldn't advocate for Kenyan children to be adopted internationally, because there is plenty of capacity in Kenya to look after them. That there are Kenyan families who, given the right conduit and the right contacts, will very happily look after. For example, Kenyan orphanages are a post-colonial hangover. Before British rule, there was no such concept as an orphanage. For example, even in the Maasai culture today, there's no word for orphan because the village automatically just looks after the
but you can't go back to the past.
You can't, of course not, no. But if you look at it like this, if you rescue people in a boat, you take them into the boat, but you don't expect them to live in that boat for the rest of their lives. Similarly, if you rescue children and take them to a rescue centre or to an orphanage, you can't reasonably expect them to thrive and to mature in that environment.
And I know Kenya is the area that you have a large amount of specialisation in, but would you say the same for India? Would you say the same for, Ireland's past involvement in Romania, for example?
Absolutely, yeah, because the difficulty is that we have, in this report, which was published in May, we have country profiles. If there is a demand for volunteering, there is no shortage of orphanages just to feed that demand, so that you have children literally trafficked into institutions who are there for the period the volunteers are placed there. Then they are sent back to their families until the whistle blows and they come back again for the next batch of volunteers. So voluntourism and the travel industry are actually feeding the need for orphanages. And this in itself then, of course, is the need has been met by volunteers. So it's a circle that goes round and round.
And what is your position on foreign aid?
Foreign aid, I think, there's a huge imbalance in how the world's resources are. So, ideally we would have an equalisation of resources so that nobody is hungry. But foreign aid is only aid if it builds capacity. If it replaces capacity or deflates an economy in the country in which it has been spent, then it's actually, not only is it worse than useless, it's actually harmless. So any foreign aid, I think, should be to build capacity and delivered in partnership, in a respectful partnership, that you respect the capacity of the people on the ground and you enhance rather than replace that.
All right, Gerry O Donoghue, founder of Maintain Hope, thank you very much for coming into us this evening.